Good afternoon. In this video I'm again going to deal with the issue of dispensational salvation and the heresy that is known as the idea that the Old Testament saints were saved by a combination of faith and works. And I'm going to go back to the issue of justification. And Brother Kim wrote a book, again, Ruckmanism Ruckus, talking about the issue of justification. He makes a big deal about arguing about the justification in James 2, arguing against Knox saying that that justification is before men. And Kim was arguing about that. And on page 141, arguing saying that's not true and that wasn't the justification being referred to there. But that's exactly what it is. And Ruckman actually teaches that. So I don't think Kim actually knows what Ruckman is actually teaching. I don't think Kim has actually studied Ruckman's works thoroughly, because he's not representing what Ruckman actually teaches, because it's actually too confusing. It's actually, if you actually taught what Ruckman taught, you have a vast series of contradictions, and that's why you can't lay it out clearly, because, and we'll go through the footnotes that he has in his reference Bible, and Walker's here, dispensationalism. We'll see all this. We're going to put together. And by the way, not one faith works guy has ever shown up on my videos refuting anything I've said. I put notes on Kim's videos about Lot. I've told him that I was making this series, and yet not one comment came back on me. He said he makes some videos, I guess, arguing with me or something, but if he has, he's never linked me to any of them. But there's a deafening silence from the faith works crowd, and this is the guys that dogmatically, just like Ruckman does, put this out like it actually makes sense. But we'll have a lot more videos dealing with this and showing this lie, this heresy, that anybody could say that God would actually be dependent on someone doing works in order to save them eternally. Faith works has to deal with blessings, and that's just the same way in the Christian life. We have to bear fruit. The only difference is we have an inward source, and they had to obey an outward source. But we'll have more details on that in the future. But anyway, he says here, the justification mentioned in James 2 is not referring to declared righteous by those who observe his good works, because salvation is strongly implied by the context of James 2, especially 14. But again, it's not salvation dealing with eternal salvation, and salvation has many connotations, and that's something else we'll deal with. But the issue is in James 2 isn't responding to eternal salvation. But the point is that in justification, he's making a point that it's not justification before men, but that's exactly what Ruckman says it is. In his work on Romans, he says here, Abraham's faith was completed and made perfect in Genesis 22, and the book was closed on his justification. Now get this, remember this. He had God's imputed righteousness in him back in Genesis 15. When God sees his own righteousness, he has to impute his justification. He has to say that this man is justified. He isn't waiting for any man to do works after he sees his own righteousness. His righteousness demands that God justify it, because it's perfect. When you receive imputed righteousness by God, at that point, God sees you as perfect, and therefore he cannot condemn you. That was the whole issue when they tried to condemn Israel. In a national sense, the nation had been blessed and was considered perfect in the eyes of God. But on an individual basis, what Ruckman is trying to tell you, that someone can get the imputed righteousness of God and not be justified at that very moment, which is totally against the divine attributes. But he goes on here to say, but it was years between the time Abraham received God's righteousness and the time he was declared righteous in the sight of men. That's what James is referring to. Justification in the sight of men. In the Old Testament, if man's faith produced works, and those works showed what kind of faith he had. And so that's Ruckman's claim is that you had to show, you didn't have a perfect faith, therefore you had to show, you had to develop a perfect faith and show what kind of faith you had in order to receive this justification, even though you had the imputed righteousness of God. But the point here on this video is, Kim is trying to say that the justification in James is not before men, and Ruckman says that's exactly what it is. And that's why Ruckman is saying because he was justified before men, then God justified him with his own personal justification for salvation. So Kim is arguing with Knox over this issue, arguing what the word justification means in James 2, and saying it's the same justification in Romans 4. But the fact of the matter is, even Ruckman agrees that this is a justification before men. What Ruckman is saying is that because Abraham was justified before men, that led to God to justifying him with an eternal justification, or dealing with his salvation. So Kim is arguing against Knox, and Knox is correctly saying that justification in James 2 is before men, is a different type of justification. The justification in Romans 4 is dealing with God's imputed righteousness, and therefore God by his own justice has to say that man is justified in his eyes eternally through faith alone. That's how Abraham received that imputed righteousness, by faith alone. He didn't do any works for it, so that justification must follow by the essence of God. God cannot deny justifying that man when he imputes righteousness to him. That's what David was saying in that psalm. That's how it always works. It's always worked because that's how grace operates. When you believe what God tells you to believe, what he said for salvation was necessary for salvation, you believed it. God imputed his righteousness to you by faith alone, and he received immediately his justification, because that righteousness demanded that justification. The righteousness the justification that appeared before men showed a blessing righteousness that was part of that justification, and it glorified God, and it showed that you were walking by faith and were growing in grace and growing in intimacy with God. So when he says here, Kim says here, the justification mentioned in James 2 is not referring to declared righteous by those who observe his good works. He's contradicting what Ruckman said in Romans, in his commentary on Romans. And what Kim doesn't understand is that what Ruckman is saying is that in Old Testament, the man to be saved had to be justified before men before he could be justified by God in the eternal sense. And so that's what Ruckman is teaching, which of course is absurd. But the argument that Kim puts up and saying that Knox is wrong and saying that this justification is not before men is incorrect, because even Ruckman admits that fact, that in fact it's because Abraham was justified before men that he was therefore justified by God in the salvation sense. So there's no disagreement between Ruckman and Knox on the issue of what kind of justification is being done in James. The only thing is that what Ruckman has to do is try to switch it around and try to make this justification before men have to deal with Abraham's faith that somehow had to be perfected in order for him to be truly justified, when in fact he already had God's imputed righteousness in him, and that is the basis for your salvation. That is the basis for forgiveness of sins, and God must justify you when he sees his own righteousness in him. And therefore Abraham was saved immediately when he received that imputed righteousness in his soul, and therefore his sins were forgiven. They were covered because the cross hadn't been done yet, hadn't historically happened yet, and that's why they went. Old Testament saints went to Abraham's bosom. But James is speaking about justification before men, and according to Ruckman, that's in total agreement with Knox. And what Ruckman is saying is that an Old Testament saint before the law had to be justified to show his faith had in fact been perfected in order for him to receive eternal salvation. So he contradicts. Kim doesn't understand that, and is arguing with Knox over this, when in fact Knox and Ruckman are both agreeing on that. Justification is before men in James, and the reality is that what Ruckman is trying to lead us to believe is that imputed righteousness doesn't lead to immediate salvation, which of course is nonsense. Amen. Thank you.